it kind of depends how you ride the bike too. Like he's almost a little bit behind the bike, I would say. So having that higher, wider bar with sort of that roll forwards kind of gives you like a quick engagement or like initiation. Just for fun riding, I would go with the mullet.
Okay.
If I was racing enduro, 100% it'd be 29.
Okay.
Starting with the fork, there are only so many forks out there. There's a lot of different bikes and the suspension types they have. So just taking something and isolating it, something I know I'm familiar with, I'll usually start with a baseline pressure depending on the length of the fork.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. Today we've got special guest, Matt Beer. So Matt, we're going to start by one question. Do you know how many articles you have written for Pinkbike since you've been working there?
No, I haven't counted, actually. That's a good question.
453.
Oh, wow. Okay.
As long as my sources is correct.
Yeah, that's almost 100 a year.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So the point is, you've been riding a ton of different parts, ton of different bikes at Pinkbike, but also before then.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to bring us to chat about bikes, mostly, you know, all things bikes.
Yeah.
Suspension, tires, frames, geometry, pretty much everything. So most people know you recently from Pinkbike, but before that, obviously, you raced a lot of downhill.
Yeah, fair bit. A couple of years as like a privateer on the World Cup scene, kind of starting around 2011, I guess. But yeah, rode a ton of bikes back home in Newfoundland where I grew up riding and building trails, and that probably started. I guess actually my first photo on Pinkbike was in 99. So
oh wow,
there you go.
Okay, and you've been Canadian champion of downhill, elite.
Yeah,
a few times.
Yeah, twice. 2012 in Mount St. Anne and 2015 in Sun Peaks.
Yeah, because I remember that because I met you because we worked together in 2013, and at the time you were the reigning Canadian champion of downhill. So yeah, that was a while back. But yeah, you've always been super, I guess, dialed with, as you would expect to go fast, you need to be dialed with your bikes. But I feel like very knowledgeable about settings and, you know, what you're looking for in a bike. And now it makes even more sense because you testing the bikes and telling us what we think, what you think of the bike. And very often I ask you questions, especially at this time of the year when I'm considering new potential partner. I always ask you if you've got a chance to try X or Y product, what you think, and so let's jump into it.
Yeah, well, I think that sort of stems from a racer. Like as you have limited time to prepare and get into a race, there's only so many runs you can do in a certain amount of time during the day, and I think that helps you weed out what works pretty quickly and what doesn't, whether that's necessarily the right thing. It's what works for you or for each individual person. So the racing definitely helps you sort that out. And I've always just been curious as a kid too, like riding hardtails back in the day with stems that were way too long and then trying to fit a shorter one and jumping on my friend's bike and seeing how that reacted versus what I was riding. So yeah, I think trying out so many different bikes and changing parts, even if I knew they weren't as good as the top of the line at the time, I was like, I'm just curious to see how this reacts, and always playing with that stuff. And we've definitely had tons of chats as well. Like, yeah, from starting way back in 2013 up until, you know, probably a few days ago, we were talking about geometries or anti-kickback devices and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, we definitely go deep in it.
So yeah, we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff. As you mentioned, like I think, and I was on a walk today with a friend and we were chatting about Jackson Goldstone's setup as far as handlebar goes. So for the people who haven't analyzed how Jackson rides a bike, obviously he goes very fast. He's got like a lot of atypical stuff. but his bars are rolled forward quite a lot. And that's typically not the right way to do it. Most people shouldn't run their bars this far, but clearly it works well for him.
Yeah.
And so we're speculating on what would be the reason why he would run his bar forward, because that will change his reach by up to like 5-10 millimeters, depending how far forward you run them. Like he runs them like...
Yeah, but then they're also quite high, so that kind of detracts from the reach, but then they're also pretty wide for him too. So all of those things maybe still add up to an increase in reach, which could be a factor that he's looking for. But I always wondered, like he grew up sort of in the limelight of these like dirt jump movies or little videos like as a kid from a very young age. And although he didn't really ride a BMX bike, I see like a lot of that forward bar roll come into play for like street BMXers.
Yeah.
And also moto trials.
Trials, but I remember he actually bought my old trials moto.
Yeah.
And I remember, obviously, you have to run the bar like forward on trials bike to have the weight forward, because you're mostly going up.
Mostly on one wheel, forwards anyways, yeah.
But I don't remember him going extreme. I actually rode moto with him a couple of days ago, and I vaguely look at his bars, but they seem like his moto bars were set up the normal way, which is basically parallel to the head tube.
Well, I bought his Enduro moto, and I didn't change anything for the first while, and he had very high-rise bars for what people would consider Enduro trails around here. Like, it's not the norm.
Yeah.
And they were more rolled back than what I can see on his mountain bike.
Yeah.
So, yeah, horses for courses, it's all, different bikes and where you're riding them and how you're riding them and the incline of the trail, generally what you're trying to do, right?
What I try to explain to people when setting up a bike, obviously there is, some stuff that scientifically makes a lot of sense, but at the end of the day, you want a setup that's going to make you feel comfortable and confident. Because if you feel comfortable, if you feel confident, then you're going to be able to ride relax and to go fast. So I'm sure he's done plenty of testing.
Yeah. That's kind of what I alluded to when I was talking about a racer getting set up quickly. It's like maybe not necessarily the ideal setup, or if a suspension tuner set up their bike, but they find a sweet spot and they just know and can trust the bike. And that's what's most confidence inspiring for them. Yeah. So what Jackson's looking for in particular, I'm not quite sure, but it kind of depends how you ride the bike too. Like he's almost a little bit behind the bike, I would say. So having that higher, wider bar with sort of that roll forwards kind of gives you like a quick engagement or like initiation. But if somebody was maybe a more forward weight biased rider like myself, like I tend to ride bigger bikes than maybe my height would depend or like dictate the size for. And I ride more in the middle or forward on the bike. And if I was to ride a bar that was rolled that far forward, I would be all over the place. It would make the bike so twitchy because my weight would go into the handlebars so quickly.
Yeah, it's funny, like people having a position on the bike that's, pretty center, pretty forward or backward. I feel like when I look at someone else riding, I can describe their riding, but me, I have no idea if I ride forward, backwards, or middle. I feel like I ride pretty centered, but then obviously if you ride something really steep, then you move backward, but so do everybody. I feel like the neutral position. So what would you say like Loic Bruni's riding position is?
I would say he's pretty centered. Yeah. But then he's also on...
But it's quite on the back as well.
Yeah, but he's also been on smaller bikes in the past, and now he's moved to a larger bike, it looks like. And now it seems like he's more centered. Before, for sure, he was a little bit over the back. And there's so many other factors that come into play there, like just how soft and progressive his bike was. Even though he's lower over the bike, he was kind of riding low to the ground, whereas Jackson's bike is quite stiff and he's up high, like he's standing up tall, sort of in the, I always say like the poise or like the stance of the bike. Like he's almost like Danny Hart would do, like tall rider, given how big the bike is.
Yeah. It's pretty cool to see like there's so many style, and clearly, I feel like Jackson and Loic bikes are almost like visually, they almost look the two extreme. One looks like pretty stiff, pretty playful. The other one looks like really glued to the ground. Like Loic's fork, it seems like it's so much on the travel. Like it feels like it's sagging a lot.
Yeah.
And it makes it look like it puts a lot of weight. I mean, obviously it dives, so it puts a lot of weight on his hand and his shoulder. Like visually, like almost too much. Like I just like if it was me riding, I would struggle to imagine that I would not want to run the front of the bike stiffer and higher to compensate that.
Well, that's just it. Like everybody's different. I mean, even his teammate Finn rides even lower. Like he must hit his visor off his bars all the time because he's like tucked in like a ski racer.
But I wonder if Finn didn't learn that from, riding with Loic, from being on the team. And, at some point, like, did Finn get told, hey, this is what works really well for Loic, you should ride this?
I think there's definitely an influence there. I think it was a bit of a natural progression too, because he also went through this kind of crazy growth spurt from being a Grom and kind of learning all these things and getting into Whistler whip off at an early age, and then building those skills, and then going to a World Cup and having a team, like you said, tell him how to set up the bike, and him kind of working back and forth with that. So there's probably a bit of a progression there.
But to go back to Jackson, I'll ask him. I want actually to chat with him about his bars, like not the ball, but like the length of the bar.
Yeah.
Because that's actually we can chat about that with you. So when you buy a handlebar, typically they come at 800 millimeters. You should cut them down based on mostly the size of your shoulder, what feels comfortable, but it's really hard to know until you've done it a few times, until you tried. And so obviously once you cut the bar too short, well, you have to buy a new set. There's no going back. So it's like pretty crazy. I guess it's pretty scary for people to like find out what works. But I was chatting with Jackson, and him being pretty small and skinny, I was expecting him to be on 740.
Yeah.
750 maybe. For example, Jesse Melamed is on 720.
Whoa.
On an enduro bike.
Okay. It's still pretty narrow.
Which is still like very narrow. Myself, I'm at 738 on every bike I own pretty much. But Jackson was actually at 780.
Yeah.
Which I did not expect that.
Well, I guess, you want a lot of leverage, especially when you get that high. You need more leverage to tip the bike from side to side. So a narrow bar wouldn't really give you that. And then also the width adds some stability too, right? Like downhill versus enduro, overall average speeds are much higher. So he's probably looking for a bit of stability there. And maybe be curious to find out like what he rides on a short travel bike or something.
Yeah.
Could be smaller.
Yeah, definitely. And technically, you have to avoid much less trees when you go on a downhill World Cup track versus an enduro track. Like the trails are not nearly as tight.
Yeah.
Moving the bike left and right is probably not as important. Or I guess you probably won't make as much of a difference on the clock than carrying your speed through like long corners and rock gardens. But now, if we forget the handlebars for a little bit. I wanted with you to chat about geometry. So how tall are you?
I'm 178 centimeters or 5'9".
Okay, and so that's pretty much what most people will consider between a medium and a large.
Yeah,
so
stuck there.
So someone your size, what bike size do you think you should be riding?
I would think that would correlate to a medium. But I always use the example of t-shirt sizing. It's like, it's all over the show. Like most brands, I'm a large, but then if you put it in the dryer, it becomes, it's this whole game of guessing. But for bikes, I would say I'm typically, I would trend towards a size large, although I often get caught in the middle. I would usually rather go larger than shorter wheelbase.
Yeah, and I'm the same. Like to choose between a bike slightly too big or slightly too small, I'll reserve a bike that's slightly too big. And that's going back to whatever makes you more comfortable and confident on the bike. I feel like moving the bike around for me is my strength, whereas like going really fast when it's bumpy and jumpy and like really rough is my weakness. So having a longer bike kind of helps me. But yeah, for people, it's, looking at a size medium and trying a medium bike on one brand and then trying their friend's bike that's also medium, that feels much bigger or much smaller. So if we talk about like reach number, because to me, when looking at like even Propane, when I order my bike, whenever they come out with a new bike and I know I'm going to get a pre-production or prototype, before ordering the size, I always check the geometry.
Yeah.
And
I'm always into that.
Like for me, that's the most important. I don't really look, for example, the gravel bike that's here is a size small.
Yeah.
And that was based on the reach. Because all my mountain bikes are size medium. Even my downhill bike is a large. I don't own any other bike in size small than the gravel bike. And that's fully based off the numbers.
Based off of your
like my preference.
Analysis, sorry?
Yeah, my preference based on, and for the gravel bike and road bike, obviously I have like much less knowledge.
Yeah.
But I've ridden enough road bikes that, I know for the different brands that I've had in the past that, a size 52 fits me really well.
Yeah.
What's the reach? What stem do you use? Because obviously a road bike uses a longer stem than a gravel bike. So trying to make the math and figure out. But so for a mountain bike, so you're 1.78 meters, what's your ideal reach?
I mean, it also
for an enduro bike.
Yeah, okay. I was gonna say it also depends on the discipline. But we'll start with the enduro. I would say 475. The stack can kind of change. Obviously, you can account for that with different bar heights and such too. But I would say 470 to 475 is like a great starting number.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reach, by the way, for people who don't know, is the horizontal distance between basically above the bottom bracket and the middle of the head tube. My preferred reach used to be, it's funny because it got bigger over the year. As the bikes got longer, I came to realize that I actually like a longer bike. So like my ideal reach is for a trail bike, so that I'm going to be riding with a 35mm stem is going to be 455 to 460.
Yeah.
I find that's like and once again, like the bike that's going to be 460, for example, this one.
Yeah.
It's actually slightly less because it's mullet. So realistically would be like more like 458. It's a bike that's going to be less playful than for example, my Tai, but it's also going to feel more stable and faster. But for what I'm going to do with it, more shuttling, I actually want a bike that's going to be feeling like longer and more planted. So this actually works really well for me. So 475 for you, what's the ideal stem length?
I feel like that really depends on the head angle.
Okay.
So for a steeper bike, say like a 120 mil, not an XC race bike, but like a general all-around trail bike in the short travel category, tend to have head angles between 65 and 66 degrees. I find something like a 50 mil stem works really well for that. And for an enduro bike with a slacker head angle, maybe 64 or 63.5 degree head angle, I tend to go down to like a 40 or a 35. And that's generally keeping the bars the same width. But what I find the shorter stem does with the slacker head angle is that you don't get the sensation of your hands really dropping from side to side. They just move in like a smaller arc. There's less change as you get through the turn with the handlebars. It feels more neutral with the slack head angle and the short stem. If you like blew this out of proportion and you put an 80 mil stem on a slack bike, you'd really get that swing effect. And I find that can really disrupt how you're cornering once you get halfway into a turn and are turning the bars.
Yeah.
And I kind of find the same thing on downhill bikes. Like it's sort of catch-22. Like the rake or the offset of the fork is always a consideration too. And the longer the offset, the more stable it is. But you also get a degree of that flop, I guess, is more or less what it is the wheel like falling to the side naturally, just because it's further away from that axis that runs through the head tube. Whereas if you have a shorter one, yes, it's less stable, but to me, it's easier to dictate where the wheel is in the turn.
So like you're saying that, well, I guess on a downhill bike, because typically it's like the tube is 62 to 63.5.
Yeah.
Like roughly around there. The standard for stem is 45, 50 millimeters these days?
Yeah, I would say, 50 for a lot, but 45, some going down to 40.
You're also limited with, I guess, with the length of the stanchion. Yeah. I remember, like, for example, on a Fox 40, at the time, I was riding a 45 millimeter stem, if I'm correct. Yeah, I think it was a 45 millimeter stem with a Fox 40, and I think I was limited by how low I could go, which for me was fine because I was riding like I and half, that I was just above the stanchion. But that would mean, because of the design of the crown, you won't be able to go lower with a 45 millimeter stem.
Yeah, I mean
that was 10 years ago. So like the design of the crown,
the length of the head tube, there's a bunch of things can get tight there, depending on the length of the stem and the length of the stanchion is the length of the head tube. But yeah, basically you run into problems with your bars hitting the top of the stanchions at some point, which we don't see in moto because the fork is designed around that, and the head tube lengths don't change. There's no dependent frames.
Like you can't really play that much. There is like a couple of marks on the top of like the WP fork, which is what comes.
Need to get 10 to 15 mils at the most.
Not even like if that. I think it's. I know I'm at the line number 3, which is one below stock. So whatever, like because the motos, and we can talk about that later, but they are really assembled to like the millimeter.
Yeah.
Every setup from the factory, like the shop has to put it a certain way, whichever is the customer. Whereas mountain biking, there is, the level of like spacer below the stem often is up to the customer to choose when they order online, or up to whoever builds the bike at the bike shop. I don't think it's as specific.
No.
Of course, like the steer tube, like cuts pre-cut for the most part, but I'm sure some brands like don't cut the steer tube. So therefore, it's whoever at the shop builds the bike to kind of decide how many spacer goes. But so you were talking about stack. Like, is it a number you look at when you review a bike, or I guess when you like? My question is like, does stack matter?
Yeah, I think so. Like, especially if you're on the upper end in terms of or I guess the lower end of the sizing scale for a specific size. If you're trying to get your bars higher to account for a long, let me start that over. Yeah, I think it matters. If you're on the lower end of a sizing spectrum, on the upper end of a sizing spectrum, I'm riding a medium and I'm trying to make it bigger. So inherently, I want the bars higher because it has a short head tube. Well, that's taking away from the reach at the same time. So yes, stack matters because it's sort of your baseline starting point. You can't really add more stack without taking away the reach. So it does change the sizing, but basically the stack and the reach sort of dictate the distances both horizontally and vertically between your feet and where your hands are on the bike. So you can have a short reach with a tall stack that feels somewhat similar to a long reach and a short stack, but it's a drastically different position, although you're stretched out the same amount. So
like the distance between basically your hips and your hands is gonna be the same, but like where your hands are in position compared to the ground is gonna be very different. And so the stack, by the way, is the distance between like the axle of the front wheel and the
bottom bracket to top of the head tube.
Oh, it's bottom bracket.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, which doesn't change much, but I guess the bottom bracket changes from one bike to another, whereas the distance from the front axle, I mean, depending on the tire, changes, but not as much. So what I do when I build a bike is I look at the length of the head tube, because from different models, the head tube length changes. Like for propane, it's usually around like 110 millimeters, but depending on what type of headset they use. So for example, if they use the ICR headset, which stands for Internal Cable Routing System, they kept the headset of the bike fairly short because that adds like 15 millimeter of spacers below the stem. So that means that then the lower you could go for your stem, you have to account for the fact that there is also
You have a minimum.
Yeah, there's a minimum. But because I get the fork separately from the frame, I get to decide how much spacer I want below the stem. And
You're not running cables to the headset.
On most bike, I'm not. No. Like now on the Tai, so on the Spindrift, you have the choice. And on the Tai, you also have the choice to either run them inside the frame or outside, or I guess through the down tube.
Yeah.
Instead of the head tube.
Yeah.
Like the standard way.
Yeah.
So you get to choose. The only bike as of right now is the Icano 2 CF. Still has the cable going through the headset, but it's also an e-bike that's got a fairly long head tube, and I run my bars like fairly high, so it works out well for me.
Yeah.
But often on the trail, you see people with head tubes that are just too short, and maybe it's because they bought the bike used, or that's how the bike came and they never changed it.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'd like to tell people is take your time to experiment before you cut your steer tube.
Yeah.
And it's pretty scary for most people because once you cut the steer tube too short, it's even more expensive than a handlebar.
For sure.
So, and then, to resell the fork, and obviously that limits your choices.
Yeah.
So on every bike I own, like I still have like 5 to 10 millimeter of spacer above the stem, just in case, I kind of like change my mind or I start to like a higher stack.
Measure twice, not once.
But also
play around.
Also on some bike I have a 50 millimeter rise bar. And I was always with a 35 millimeter rise, but I found out on some bikes like I needed to be even higher. And so I had the choice with adding like 15 millimeter of spacer based on having a 35 millimeter rise bar, or going for a 50. So what's your thought on the 50 millimeter rise bar?
I mean, I would say generally taller riders are going to want a higher rise bar, but I mean, the flex comes into play too. Like generally higher rise bars have more flex than flatter ones. Obviously carbon ones, you can lay them up differently, but aluminums definitely tend to be that way. And then, so yeah, depicting, say we're staying all on the same brand, depicting the flex and the bends and everything. I don't really have a huge preference there, but I would say generally on enduro bikes, I'm in between a 30 and a 40 mil rise. Like 50 is kind of extreme, unless, I'm looking to set up a bike for a super steep track or do some kind of wacky experiment just to check out how a super high rise bar works. Then no, I probably wouldn't lean towards those.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so like we talk about stem bars. To go back to the start, like I asked you what's your ideal reach. But so obviously when you look at a bike, anyone like purchasing any bike from any brand, you go to the geometry chart at the bottom of the website, at the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
So you look at the reach, because there is obviously a lot more. There's seat tube angle, head tube angle, chain stays, bottom bracket height, wheelbase. So if you had to rank, like, what are the most important numbers that people should be looking at? And what are the numbers that, like, maybe don't matter as much?
I think it also depends on who you're talking about, like what level of rider. For somebody who's maybe a bit more introductory to the sport, they could probably lean on a shop or a website's FAQ page to kind of direct them and go along with the sizing. But I usually recommend people demo or at least sit on a bike at the very least. If you can get into a shop or an experience center and just swing a leg over the bike and just see how that fits, how it feels, and go up or down a size, compare it. If you have you're moving from one bike to another, look up your current bike's geometry chart and compare that with the other one and see what those numbers add up to and how one brand's sizing chart lines up with the other and where you kind of fall on that. But I mean, people say that bigger bikes are easier to ride. I would say that bigger bikes being longer are safer to ride, but they're not always easier.
They're pretty easier to go straight down the mountain.
Yeah.
But then once you start to have to make like really technical corner, you realize that having a bigger bike is not always better.
So I've actually chatted with a couple different friends and colleagues and other people that have reached out about bike sizing. So we've gone into the weeds here pretty deep lately, and a good example is that new Trek Fuel EX, MX, and LX. And basically they have sort of 3 trail, almost up to enduro bikes, different size travel amounts, different forks and everything, but they use the same main front triangle, and then with a couple different links you can change the travel and such. But even within those sizes, each change you make to that tweaks the geometry here or there. And so a buddy was trying to decide between an XL and a large, and he's kind of right on the fence. And so he took out an XL that we happen to have in for a project, and he was like, "Oh no, like on paper this looks like it would have worked," and then he was glad he wrote it. So yeah, I think swinging a leg over a bike gives you a pretty good idea quickly.
And also, like, of course, if you like can try the bike of one of your friends, it's great. But one thing to always keep in mind is make sure you understand like all the different parameters that affect how the size of a bike feels. Like we could have the exact same frame, but like, as we mentioned with Jackson, like the roll on the bar is different, the stack height is different, the stem length.
Yeah. Even the suspension, like the pressure, like when I sit on your bike, it gets even smaller.
Because it sags more,
Yeah. So all those things kind of come into account. And it's definitely not an easy game. I think a bit of extra expertise to lean on online from shops, from brands helps. But there's nothing that's going to replace kind of getting your feet wet and getting on there.
No, and like so for example, one up components got 3 sizes of stem: 35 millimeter, 42, and 50 millimeters. That's for the general like trail stem. Between a 35 and a 42, if you put them on a table and you look at them, 7 millimeter doesn't seem like a lot. Even visually, I can see the difference, but I still have to check that it actually says 35 millimeter or 42 millimeter to know that I'm grabbing the right one. Obviously, if they're next to each other, it's easier to tell. But I put one on. So one of my bike, I wish was like a few millimeter longer. Like I wish. And I put a 42 millimeter stem, which I normally use a 35. And yes, like when I was standing up on the bike, it felt better. But then it just felt weird. Like I wasn't used to having like the extra distance past the steer tube. Like just
so turning felt different.
Turning felt different. Going down steeps, like I felt like I struggled to have as much weight on the bike, which obviously makes sense because if the stem is longer, naturally you got more weight on the front. It just didn't feel right for me. So I would rather like have a bike that feels slightly shorter with the right like feel of the stem and the bars, rather than having a bike that feels the right size for me, but that feels a little bit off. And that's completely due to personal preference and how I got used to riding the bike, because I used to run a 40 millimeter stem before and I didn't really have a complaint. So I think, when people try the bike from one of their friends, you just have to make sure that all the setup seems right for you, like from suspension to even little things, but like the angle of your brakes. Like if I was to ride someone's bike that's got the brakes like this, it will just not work for me. And
where your hands are rolled, and that pulls your shoulders forward, and that moves your weight further forward on the seat and everything else. So yeah, it all adds up.
So now, like 2 questions for you. Like the first one, obviously you're always riding. You see a ton of people within the industry or just bike fans on the trail. what are like some common mistakes that you see people making on their bike or equipment that negatively affect their experience of mountain biking? Before we keep on riding, let me introduce you the partner of this video, Jenson USA. Jenson has been a huge part of the success of this YouTube channel, and they are an online retailer. They basically sell every product I'm using, from my Maxxis tires, my Ergon grips, one-up bars, even DVO suspension or Hayes brakes. You can also find my Topic tools, my specialized helmets, and my Useway backpacks. If you want to find those products, simply check out the links down below, and when you purchase using those links on Jenson, that support my channel. So thanks so much for that. Now let's go back to riding.
The one I see the most is sag, like people not running the correct balanced suspension. And that just, like we talked about before, just me sitting on your bike, it changes the pitch of the bike, it changes the handling, it changes your weight bias on the bike. So that, number one, is to check the sag. And the same kind of goes for the tires. Like they're maybe more apparent and less of a factor in terms of the balance and stuff. Like you kind of know when they're off, but I know a lot of people that just use a shitty floor pump and then go to their friend's shitty floor pump, and you'd be surprised the extra traction you get if you are 4 psi higher versus 4 psi lower. So yeah, I think some basic setups like that and routine checks are worthwhile. The other one, yeah, is probably the handlebar position, just like extreme far forward or extremely too far back. And everybody has their preferences, but I think there's, sort of like, like a bell curve where everybody should be within.
Yeah.
And that can be dictated by the style or the angles of the bike too. Because I've found my preferences can sometimes change depending on the bike. So other than that, I don't know what else.
I think overall, like to like bounce on what you just said, it's like mountain biking is a mechanical sport.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to take a bit of time to understand how the bike works, how the suspension works, what setting does what, like without being super necessarily like super scientific about it, but just understanding what your rebound does, what your compression does, what the air pressure does. So when you go about setting the bike and you have complaint about your bike and you're like, oh, my bike feels like it's bucking me over the bar. Like I feel like it's too bouncy. Like you know what to adjust because you have like a basic understanding of what does what.
There's some good apps for that now.
Yeah, there is apps. Internet's got.
Yeah,
I'm sure you could ask ChatGPT.
I mean, even like the suspension manuals, as rudimentary as they are, they're a great starting point.
Yeah,
and if nothing else, you'll end up with like a balanced and comfortable and predictable ride. It might not be ideal, but it's something to build off of. And yeah, I mean, like we're talking about moto, we're talking about road bikes. Like the road bike is so much less dynamic, and I'll probably get some flack from road bikers, but the bike itself, like the position between the axles and your contact points, your hands and your feet and your saddle, those don't move in relation to the axles. And then a moto, like it's so much heavier. It's one size. There are fewer things to tweak on it. So I'd even argue, I mean, motor aside, I think I would even argue that, a mountain bike is more complex to set up.
Yeah. And I feel like motos is fairly easy in a way because, like, for example, KTM's got mostly like one chassis. There's obviously nuances, but two chassis with, for example, the bike you have. And it's basically, I mean, the shocks are different depending on, if it's a motocross or if it's an enduro bike, but overall it's fairly similar. There is actually most likely the same number of clicks, and there's a base setting. And for example, on the forks, they've got like a comfort setting, which is pretty much their beginner setting. And then they got like a standard, and then they got a sport setting, which is like the more advanced. I think it's a difference of 3 clicks.
Right.
So it's like pretty straightforward. It's like, okay, 15 clicks, it's standard. 12 clicks of compression, it's sport, and 18, it's, comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas mountain biking, like just the air pressure, Like it's, I think the biggest thing, like starting with the right air pressure, and then you can change your volume spacer, which is gonna change the progressivity of the suspension. It is much more complicated, but definitely worth it to take the time because it can make a huge difference. Like the number of, you just sit in the Whistler Bike Park next to the airline drop, and you hear how many people bottom out on that drop coming into the corner. Sometimes people bottom out twice, like at the landing, and then they bottom out on the corner and on the takeoff of the next jump. And it's like, you'll have such a better time if you take the time to understand how everything works. And also the best way to understand is to try stuff and take notes. You try a certain air pressure in your fork and you write it down. Okay, it feels a bit too stiff. Then you remove some. Feels a bit too soft. And so at least you know where you're at. And if you keep track of everything, that makes it much easier to know your baseline and to know what's been working for you and in which case.
Yeah. And I mean, it should also be said that you have to repeat this process in similar conditions on the same track. And, that's testing, that's setting up suspension.
Yeah.
But you can't expect it to bottom out or not bottom out off of this small drop and then go to a huge drop and be like, well, I thought my air pressure was set right. And then, it's not going to work like that. And there's never going to be an ideal setup for all instances, every trail condition. So.
Yeah, it's just trying to find like a base setting, something that works like mostly well everywhere. And obviously you should put the bike at default when in a very extreme situation, when it's, a massive drop or when it's extremely slippery and therefore you go much slower. So you always pretty much have to adapt. But as you understand how things work, usually you can look at a track and have a pretty good idea of what you should change based on the experience.
Yeah, have like a little settings bank or, some notes to go off for sure.
So now you've been trying a ton of bikes, ton of parts from shoes, helmets, glasses, jackets, tires, wheels,
magnetic
brakes, pedals, pretty much anything. But like if we look at more at the bikes, which is the main thing, what are some mistakes that some brands make, without naming anyone, but what are some mistakes that you see too often that you wish the industry wasn't making?
Geez, put me on the spot with this one. I think
okay, so
it sounds basic, but I would say like overcharging for
over what, sorry?
Overcharging, like the price.
Okay.
You can get a really good aluminum bike that, people don't need to splash out on, the most marketed, dolled up carbon bike when, they probably just need to spend X amount of cash on a solid aluminum bike that does everything kind of nicely, and they're just going to go off on a nice adventure holiday somewhere and have fun and enjoy it. They don't need to, get caught up in all the BS out there.
But I feel like what's a good thing with most brands is that you get the base model that's going to have the same, well, of course there is aluminum carbon, but like if you get the base carbon model or the base aluminum model, you're going to have the same geometry and the same like research and development in the suspension platform that you're going to have for the top of the line.
And the ability to upgrade it too. Like, you're not going to upgrade the frame itself necessarily, but like the nuances between having a super kitted up aluminum bike and a super kitted up carbon bike and everything else is the same. Like, maybe it's a bit lighter, but I don't think that's going to do it for everybody at the end of the day. Like, they're not going to splash out the extra cash just to have the carbon bike. But I mean, that being said, there are a ton of great carbon bikes out there. So I'm not like canning that all together. But I think going back to your question, I got a better idea of my answer now. I think brakes. I think we're finally getting to that point, but I think brakes were like heavily undergunned for a long time, and it just made it harder to descend on. If you're braking longer, your tires are running over stuff that they shouldn't be, and they're slipping more when you're trying to go do something else. So if you can brake in that specific spot and slow the bike down, it gives you more time to change direction, get traction, get confidence, and go on to the next bit.
I don't actually even remember what it feels like to have brakes that aren't good, because I've been very happy with my brakes for like quite a few years, but I'm trying to remember from like 15 years ago. Because I feel like it's been quite a few years that the brakes are good, but like 15 years ago, not only the brakes were not as good, I also had the entry-level freeride bikes and downhill bikes.
Yeah.
So I had the good frame with the cheap parts. So I had the cheap brakes basically. And I mean, at the time I wasn't riding as much, or probably wasn't doing like stuff nearly as steep, but I remember the reliability was the inconsistency.
Inconsistent.
Yeah, like brakes were inconsistent.
Yeah.
Which now, like, obviously it's progressed a ton and it's no longer the case. But I remember like my downhill bike at the time, stock came with a 185mm rear disc.
Oh yeah.
on a stock bike, like.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean now that's out there, that's available, but you have brakes like the SRAM Mavens, which, you know, work brilliantly for slowing down e-bikes. And I think I've been spending more time on e-bikes, and those have really changed the game for that type of riding.
Yeah, I think like Haze has, you know, something that's like really powerful. I haven't tried more powerful, but I also don't feel that even on my bike, which is, you know, a full power, like one of my bikes, a full power e-bike, I feel like if I get more power, then I'm gonna be limited by the traction.
Yeah, for sure.
Because at some point, especially right now when it's slippery,
yeah.
You know, even if you press a little bit, it's, you know, it's just gonna lock the wheel, and because there's not much traction, you just end up sliding.
Yeah.
On a moto, funny enough, so like the moto, obviously I'm not very good, and so I'm not nearly as in tune as I am on a mountain bike, but the rear brake is a mystery for me, because you activate the rear brake using your foot. And I can't modulate it. It's like either I don't brake because I literally miss the pedal and I think I'm braking, but my foot is pretty next to it, or I barely touch it and I lock the rear wheel.
Yeah, and it's not like you're wearing a skate shoe. You have like a pretty heavy duty plastic boot on. So,
and the front brake is the same, where it's like the front brake, when you see the top enduro rider just doing with one finger like a nose manual, it's like, I just don't even understand how they do it, because I can do it on a mountain bike, and I find it pretty easy on a mountain bike. Like once you understand the traction and you know that your front wheel is not gonna slide because you apply pressure correctly on it. Yeah. Then your body position, you basically help your bike to move forward, and then you stabilize it using your core, and then you just so this finger, you just press on the brake and you look at it. I found that fairly simple on a mountain bike to maintain a nose manual if you got like consistent slope, but on a moto, I can't tell if my front brake is not powerful enough, because I struggle to like get the rear wheel up. Yeah. Or then I just wash out the front. So then you're like, well, then my front brake is powerful enough because I can lock the front wheel.
It's probably more of a commitment to a weight shift, I think. That's like the biggest difference.
Like the technique, yeah.
Yeah, like you got to move a pretty heavy bike, and just the different rider to system weight.
Yeah, you need to use your hips to like.
Yeah, you really got to
push your weight forward and really like. But when I see Billy Bolt and.
Yeah, and he's such a bigger guy, so he has to move less, and he's taller, and.
No, it's pretty
incredible rider.
So. Pretty impressive. Okay, we talked about the bikes.
I did want to loop back on one more thing I thought about.
Yeah.
Where brands are like maybe hosing riders, and that's just like it's a pretty big one. I don't know how I oversighted it first, but just the accessibility or like the serviceability of the bike, like with extra complex parts, especially some proprietary pieces, or maybe not necessarily they're not readily available, but more difficult to find. So like one example is, basically every mountain bike brand has moved to a UDH hanger. There are other frame constraints, sometimes depending on the suspension layout or the chainstay chips that they want to use to lengthen things, but that's been like a huge move, I feel like.
Yeah. Because I remember working in Whistler at a bike shop.
Yeah.
people will come up and try to find. So the UDH is the new standard of rear air hanger, which actually I've never broken any. So they've been, to me, it's been really solid.
Mm-hmm.
But people will come to a small bike shop at the bottom of the Whistler Bike Park, trying to find a rear air hanger from a European bike that's not sold in North America from 9 years ago. And fortunately, there was a shop in Function Junction in Whistler that could like basically make any part you will need. But yeah, I'm very glad that everybody agreed on making something fairly standard.
Yeah, and now they're looking at, I mean, SRAM and Shimano have patents for universal brake mounts, which is super cool to see. And there are even more benefits to that because it can change the braking forces applied on the frame depending on the suspension layout. They might have different frames, may have multiple mounts, so you actually change that. But another one, I mean, like, not another one, but like just to relay on the serviceability of bikes. Like if you ever tried to put a chain guide on a bike from like the late 90s to the early mid 2000s, it was such a nightmare with like different spindle widths, frame clearance, chain guide types, and none of it really worked. Like, or it was super expensive.
Like it will rub.
Yeah. And now you have what seems like such a well thought out, easy, clever system. There's basically just a couple tabs. Everybody mounts them in the same place, and they use this tiny little guide to hold the chain on. I mean, there's the 1x chain ranks and everything else, but like just that area has been so simplified over the years, which is great to see. It's made it easier for everybody to work on.
Yeah, like over the past few years, there's been like a few evolution, and also in terms of geometry and like wheel sizes, like we went through 26, 29, back to 27.5, but not everywhere.
Yeah.
Back to 29, then being like, well, let's put just a small wheel just on the back, which made a lot of sense. And even with geometry, you had bikes significantly bigger than others for the same size, whereas now everybody kind of understood, you know, what should be a size medium. Obviously, there's still difference as it should be, because if everybody did the same exact size for a medium and for a large and for an extra large, that'd be pretty tough for people like yourself, which are pretty much exactly in between two sizes. That means that you'll never be able to find a bike that like really fits you well. So it's pretty cool to see like how things have evolved. And I think it's really over the past like 2 or 3 years that everything is closer together.
Yeah.
Obviously, everybody makes good bikes.
Yeah. But it's evolving slower and things are more homogenous in the industry for sure.
So do you think as a result, people are going to keep their bike longer?
Yeah, I mean, just looking in my garage myself, like I have a 2023 model Santa Cruz Tallboy short travel trail bike. I love the thing. I can't find another bike with like sort of the same numbers that I'm looking for. And so I've just kept it. But like there's a newer model out. And I think this one was actually developed in like 2020 or 2021. That's just like, it was an update that they did to the frame, but it's pretty much the same thing. So yeah, I mean, you look around and there are a ton of different bikes that just use, now that the patent has expired, they're just using that simple 4-bar FSR layout. And it's such a simplistic, wholesome way to build a bike. Like it just has all sort of these neutral parameters. You can get good geo. It's fairly easy to manufacture too. Like there's nothing too complex compared to some other designs, you know, not an overly absurd amount of pivots. You can fit a water bottle in there. Everything's accessible. So yeah, I think sort of the steps to gain in technologies is slowing down slightly and harder to get.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that makes me think about something. So since you chatted about suspension design, when buying a bike, so you obviously look at the geometry. Like if you had to pick up a bike for yourself, obviously you look at the geometry first and foremost, I guess, to
find the right size.
Find the right size. Equipment, make sure you got the parts that you like, from, you know, brake, suspension, wheels, tires. How about suspension design? Like how much thought do you put into finding a suspension design? Like, what do you rank suspension design compared to like geometry and parts equipment?
This is funny because I'm actually like writing up a poll on this.
Okay, I didn't know.
As we speak, yeah. So, no, there's funny correlation there, but I think,
like, does suspension design matter that much? Or do you think you can overcome a suspension design that's not great by having great suspension setup?
I think you can get to a certain point, but there's, just talking about that FSR design, like I said, that kind of covers all the kinematics in a nice neutral way. You can do a lot with those pivots to change those things to a degree, but they basically have the same sort of curves and shapes and starting points for the leverage ratios and the anti-rises and anti-squats and stuff like that for sort of a baseline, I guess, or like a bracket to put them in, and they're not really going to move too far out of that. But then you get into something a bit different, like a complex dual link layout, and then things totally change, like the sort of the character of those curves and the suspension kinematics changes quite a bit. So I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong thing to look for, but certain suspension layouts can benefit different types of riders, I would say.
Yeah, I think it comes down a lot to like what the rider is looking for. If you want a bike that like pedals really well, accelerates really well. Mm-hmm. If you want something that's gonna be very plush and gives you like a lot of safety at high speed. So for example, like a high pivot where it gets like longer, but then obviously you're gonna lose on some aspect.
Yeah.
I think it's like everything. You have to like choose what benefits like the type of riding you want to do, type of trail you like.
Yeah. I'm always surprised to see a lot of free riders choosing a high pivot bike, especially if they're doing like flips or spins, because
do you think they choose a high pivot bike, or do you think it's because that's the bike that the manufacturers they ride for?
Well, there's definitely a bit of that, but I see and it's probably a bit of marketing and sort of this style or demographic that brand is appealing or aiming for, but I don't necessarily think it's the best design for them to be riding. But you can adapt to anything as well. Like you can learn what the bike's going to do, which kind of goes back to that whole figure it out as a racer mentality pretty quickly. But yeah, just the high pivot is one example. Like if you are the kind of rider that wants to hit jumps and spin and do a lot of tricks, then personally I would see how that bike could make it a bit more difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, because there are a lot of riders throwing down on those bikes. And then there are other bikes with, sort of that similar FSR design, but they have the inverted rocker link that runs off the top tube. Those bikes, although they can be quite comfortable, if you're a more aggressive rider looking to pop and jump off stuff, they can really tend to plow through the beginning part of the travel, and it kind of saps some energy from you. Not too different from a high pivot as well. So yeah, I think there are certain types of bikes that appeal to.
Because high pivot doesn't necessarily refer just to have the chain go through a higher pivot. Like it's basically the rear wheel going backwards when there is an impact. Like every bike does it to some extent, but high pivot meaning that essentially in order to counter effect that on the chain, you need to put actually a high pivot in order to compensate it. Now, like, so in terms of just a quick one, so we're talking about suspension setup. Is more progressive better?
I mean, that really comes down to what you're trying to do with the bike as well.
Because I feel like some people associate a bike that's very, very progressive to being a very good bike, which I believe is not correct.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there are certain instances or rider types that can benefit from it, but I don't think it's like a black and white rule that you can just write down. Yeah.
So when you set up a bike, are you like, can you walk us through like how you set up your bike? Let's keep it to an enduro bike.
Yeah.
Let's say your daily driver, the bike that you're gonna be pedaling around, sometimes shuttling, very occasional bike park day.
Yeah.
Can you give us like a basic rundown of like how you set it up in terms of suspensions?
In terms of suspension, just suspension. I mean, it kind of goes through these cycles. Like, I'll usually, starting with the fork, there are only so many forks out there. There's a lot of different bikes and the suspension types they have. So just taking something and isolating as something I know I'm familiar with, I'll usually start with a baseline pressure, depending on the length of the fork and the type of bike that it's on. And then that at least sort of solves one problem at a time. And then I'll focus on the rear of the bike. And usually I'll start with the manufacturer's recommendation for the sag. And then I would usually, some brands even provide the number of clicks to start with on all the damper adjustments based on that air pressure or spring rate. And then if they don't do that, I'll usually relay that information back to the brand. If I don't have a contact, I'll probably reach out to or reach for that type of rear suspension manufacturer's booklet,
Okay.
or like their user manual, and just start with the basic numbers. And again, that's like a baseline to start with. It at least gives you an idea of what's going on
For your first ride, pretty much.
Yeah. And then I would say, like, for example, I just did that King Creek review on their app, the shock tuner, back in the fall, although it seems pretty recent for me, I guess. And they had a really systematic approach to doing the same thing, like setting your sag for the rear shock, looking for these different attributes of what the shock was doing, given their baseline numbers, and just running through low speed rebound, high speed rebound, low speed compression, high speed compression. And yeah, there can be, I know, different suspension tuners, like Steve at Vorsprung has a different method to figuring those out. But I found that system to work pretty good, and that's usually what I stick to. But it can often be pretty. I can find myself back at the same starting point and just adjusting the air pressure and tweaking that more.
Okay.
So
yeah, no,
it's pretty complicated.
It is very. I feel like anytime I'm out, every single day, if I'm out and riding my bike, I could always find one thing I could improve on the setup.
Yeah.
Always. Regardless how long I've been riding the bike for, how knowledgeable I am with, the shock. It might be a shock I've had for 3 years, but I'm like, I know what, maybe I could run the rebound a bit slower or a little bit faster. Like, I'm sure that maybe I should try to lower my bars by a couple millimeter or run them higher. Or maybe I don't need to run my forks this stiff. Maybe I could let a tiny bit of pressure off. Like, there's always something you can change and improve, because every day, even the trail by heart.
Yeah.
If you ride it in middle of April when it's perfect versus, just 2 weeks later, if it hadn't rained for a couple of weeks, it's a different trail. So
yeah, for sure, you're going slower, it's slipperier, whatever. And then having a baseline trail to go to definitely helps. Like, I've got a couple laps.
What's your couple lap in Squamish that like?
I would say usually go to Angry Midget first.
Okay.
Angry M, just go there.
Yeah.
And it's a trail I know. It's not the steepest, but it has a number of different obstacles, features, turns that I kind of know what a good bike setup should do in those instances. And if that bike's not doing it, then it's fairly easy to repeat. And same in the Whistler Bike Park. Like,
what do you do in the Whistler Bike Park for a downhill bike as like a
for downhill
test lap?
Well, we were talking about enduro bikes. So enduro bikes, I'd probably do like Funshine rolly drops, that like sort of blue techie thing. And then that'd kind of give me a baseline to work up to bigger trails, harder features and stuff.
Because Funshine rolly drop, what's good about it's in the bike park, but it doesn't feel like a bike park trail.
No.
It feels like a trail that could be anywhere.
But it still doesn't change that much either.
No.
Same with Angry M. So yeah, for downhill bikes in Whistler, I feel like Canadian Open has gotten a bit easier now, but it's not always open to ride. So yeah, usually Whistler downhill into Detroit Rock is a good one. But That or sometimes down at Cypress in West Vancouver.
Yeah.
There's a couple of good tracks there that I think, been riding since 2013. So like,
so you know them well.
Yeah, and they have changed a lot actually. They put a lot of work into them, but they're still sort of like the main veins. So yeah, I think repeating and playing with one thing at a time, whether it's air pressure or rebound, can definitely help you figure out the sweet spot for the bike.
Okay, and I just want to finish like kind of this talk on if right now you could build your dream bike. So without naming any brand of frames or suspension or whatever, I'll ask you some questions. So the frame, you said 475. So like, let's assume it's a trail bike or enduro bike, a bike that you're gonna pedal.
Yeah.
The bike that you ride most of the time, that can do pretty much everything you want it to do. It's not a downhill bike. It's not any bike, obviously. So how much travel are we looking at?
170 fork, 165 rear.
Okay. What wheel setup? 29 mullet?
Just for fun riding, I would go with the mullet.
Okay.
If I was racing enduro, 100% it'd be 29.
Okay. You find it this much quicker?
Yeah, much quicker. Even more, like you can get a shorter chainstay. I find I can ride a bike with dual 29 and almost get the same, if not more, stability with those big wheels and a shorter chainstay.
Yeah.
Than an MX setup.
Okay.
You get more traction, more stability, and just rolls over stuff. So ultimately, for enduro racing, you go faster and you feel less, so you're less tired.
Yeah. Yeah, and like carrying speed is a big one for me.
Yeah.
I feel like it's quite noticeable how much more speed you carry on a 29 setup versus a mullet.
Yeah.
So frame, carbon or aluminum? Or something else?
I mean, I would go carbon if I could, because it's a bit lighter and you can tune the stiffness maybe a bit easier. But there are plenty of good aluminum frames, and even like the same iteration of that bike in aluminum versus carbon that work great. So not too partial to that.
Okay. Now moving to suspension. So sorry, before suspension, ideal geometry. So you say 475.
Yeah.
What will be your head-tube angle?
Like 63.5.
Okay. Chainstays length.
445. 450 is okay with the mullet. It's getting out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the geometry, I mean, wheelbase obviously is dependent on
all those three things.
All those three things, but that will be what, like 1275?
Yeah, I think around there. Getting over 1280 for me is like that Orbea. I'm thinking Santa Cruz Nomad versus Orbea Rayon.
Okay.
Like those two bikes definitely stand out in my mind.
Okay.
And then the Trek Slash also enters the picture. They're like 3 on the top of my list, I would say.
So then, rear shock, do you go coil or do you go air shock?
I mean, that depends on the suspension.
Okay, so what suspension design would you pick?
Yeah, I would previously would have said the VPP on the Nomad, but I think I've become less partial to some things I haven't liked in the past on like a standard FSR, or I guess the Orbea is like a single pivot linkage driven shock. But I think maybe air just out of convenience and the ability to tune the progression. Like if you're riding with a pack one day, or even doing like an easier ride or hitting jumps, like it's pretty easy to tweak that.
It's pretty easy, yeah.
Yeah, but I think there are certain suspension designs that work best with a coil shock, and maybe even vice versa.
Yeah. Okay, now moving down to something cranks.
Yeah.
What crank length would you get? Because nowadays you can choose pretty much anything.
Yeah. I think 165 is pretty comfy. Yeah. I mean, it depends on, sort of BB drop, how much sag you're running, how much travel you have. I think 165 for an enduro bike is pretty comfy.
Yeah, because you have to pedal it, right? So
yeah,
I've never gone like extreme, but I have 160 on the e-bike, on some of the e-bikes, 165 on an e-bike I pedal, and 160 on a downhill bike. I really like 160 on a downhill bike, but I don't feel the need to go shorter than this.
What do you find that the short cranks do on a downhill bike? Because it's only like, a centimeter if you're going from 165 to 160 that you're bringing your
less pedal hit, less likely to hit the ground, even though it's 5 millimeter.
When you're pedaling or not pedaling?
Not like sometime when you pedal, like, sometimes you throw like a couple of like pedal stroke, but even just like, because when you ride and when you take impact, you tend to drop your rear foot, right?
Yeah.
So your rear foot drops and gets closer to the ground. So, but
man, I remember riding that Commensal Supreme at our field test a couple of years ago, and that has 220 miles of travel. And I came down that like last sort of pitch on Detroit Rock City, and I'd never hit my foot off the ground so fucking hard. I thought I broke my heel. Like I just plowed the bike into this braking bump, and my feet were level.
Just like
where I thought they were, but like, you do tend to ride with your foot down a bit more. And
no, like anytime you slow motion, you see like the rear foot.
Yeah.
The rear foot like drops.
Yeah.
So handlebar height on that bike, what would you get?
Talking like spacers and everything too, or?
No, just like the rise.
35 seems pretty comfy.
Stem length?
Yeah, I like 35, but if 40 was on there, I wouldn't be mad.
Okay. And length of the bars?
770.
770.
I'd maybe go narrower if I was racing enduro, though, like you talked about, tight trees and corners and stuff. Yeah, I think the maneuverability of the bike comes into play more than stability necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wheels, would you go aluminum or carbon?
That's a tough one.
Like thinking also as a customer point of view with like, like, do you want to spend time to like readjust your spoke tension? And
yeah, I think for most riders, a more compliant set of carbon rims is a decent investment because you can carry them from bike to bike, and a lot of brands offer a no questions asked lifetime warranty, and they don't require the same amount of attention to keep the spokes true and the wheel centered or true. So yeah, I think carbon definitely has its benefits there. Yeah, that's a tough one. If you're looking for a lot of compliance and you're particularly hard on wheels and you don't mind spending and servicing wheels, then aluminum also has its benefits. But again, I think it's like the suspension talks. It's not like a black on white thing.
It's not black and white, no, it's fit.
Yeah.
Disc size?
Depends on the strength of the power of the brakes, but yeah, usually 200 front and rear.
Okay.
Sometimes a 220 in the front. I've even played with a 220 in the back as well on some bikes, and there's benefits there. But yeah, I think 200 is pretty easy to sort of live with for an enduro bike.
Couple of things left. Chainring size. On that one bike does everything.
Yeah, with an MX setup, I would say 32, but it depends on what you're doing with the bike. If you are maybe in the bike park more, 34 would definitely be advantageous. But if you're going to take that enduro bike into the backcountry, you're going to have a heavy pack and stuff, then you're probably going to want low gearing. Thankfully, that's something that's pretty easy to tweak. It also has an effect on kinematics and stuff too. So, and I guess a smaller chainring, you're going to be spinning more. So if you're hitting your cranks a lot, push a harder gear, then that might not be a bad thing. Having a bigger ring.
Pedals, flat or clips? Because I've known you and you were riding mostly flat.
Yeah. I still go back and forth a lot. It's like...
You still can decide?
I think clips. Like if I'm going on a trip and I can only bring one pair, I feel pretty comfy everywhere on clips, but flats are just sometimes more fun or more practical if you're doing a lot of hike biking and stuff.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, clips, I think control and just isolation. You just forget about what your feet are doing and they're there. But you definitely got to be comfy if you're getting in like tech terrain with them.
And last thing, tires. Would you go, if you could only have one set of tires, which I know you won't because you probably have all the tires, but would you go like, if we look at the Maxxis catalog, would you go Exo Plus, Double Down, or DH? If you have to keep those tires all year long and do everything with them.
For around here?
Yeah.
And you have to ride them all year. I would go Maxxis Assegai, Max Grip, Double Down in the front, and Maxxis DHR2, Double Down, Max Terra rear.
Or Double Down on the back.
Yeah. I think because it's soft enough around here, like it's kind of muddy sometimes. There aren't that many sharp rocks.
Yeah, the rocks are not that. Yeah, it's like reliability in Squamish is usually not too much of an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, there's that new trail that's I've ridden a bunch. There is one rock I couldn't see it because the dirt was like so soft. Yeah. But there was like I flatted.
Yeah.
And I was like, I heard the rock.
Yeah.
But then I went to find the rock and to remove it. It was the sharpest rock in Squamish. Like it was like just like a knife.
Did the same thing on like trying to do like a POV on some bike review and just I was like, what? I knew I hit something and I went back to look and I was like, digging, and it was just this jagged point. So it happens, but yeah, I would say the terrain here is more forgiving, even more than like the North Shore.
Yeah. Yeah, the North Shore is definitely. Okay, well, I think that answered like pretty much all the questions I had for Matt today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you subscribe, like it, comment. And okay, let's get some food and we'll ask you some more questions next time.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for having me.